One moment, it's loading.
Okay. It says meeting streamt jetzt live.
So, live.
Ja, ist live. So, ja, dann habe ich gerade erfahren, dass wir live sind und dann begrüße ich alle, die sich zugeschaltet haben. Mein Name ist Christoph Meyer, ich bin hier aus Berlin-Pankow und wir haben heute zu Gast Dr. Pierre-Louis Choquet, der heute aus Brasilien zugeschaltet ist. Und wir werden den ganzen Vortrag auf Englisch machen. Also Pierre-Louis Choquet ist Franzose, wird aber trotzdem Englisch sprechen. Und wenn es irgendwelche Verständigungsschwierigkeiten gibt, kann man das gleich im YouTube-Chat nachfragen. Wir haben noch eine Person im Hintergrund, die dann die Fragen im YouTube-Kanal hier in den Livestream einspielen wird. Und dann werde ich versuchen, sie zu beantworten. Oder wir werden versuchen zu beantworten. So, jetzt noch kurz. Es geht heute darum, dass 3 Historiker eine Studie veröffentlicht haben vor ein paar Wochen, die den Konzern Total bzw. Total Energie betreffen. Und dort haben sie untersucht, wie sich eigentlich dieser Konzern in Bezug auf die Klimabedrohung verhalten hat. Sind dabei auf etwas gestoßen, dass nämlich der Konzern Total schon sehr lange davon wusste, aber nicht entsprechend gehandelt hat. Das ist also ähnlich gelaufen, wie vielleicht schon bekannt US-amerikanische Ölkonzerne es gemacht haben. Da kommen wir dann später drauf zu sprechen. Und jetzt wechsle ich auf Englisch und beginne jetzt mit dem Vortrag, beziehungsweise das machen wir ganz locker in Interviewform. So, hello, Pierre-Louis. I just introduced.
Guten Abend.
Yeah, thanks. I just introduced you to the Germans here, which are with us on YouTube, and you are Dr. Pierre-Louis Choquet, and are part of a team that researched the role of Total Energy. At that point, it was Total and Elf Aquitaine, 2 oil companies in France. How they reacted to the news that there is a threat to the climate. And well, the first thing I said that you are currently in Brazil, so the internet connection might be wobbling a bit, but what are you doing there at the moment?
In Brazil first. So I'm doing a postdoc. It's actually, I've for now ceased more or less to work on Total. And I'm still working on the issue of the regulation of transnational corporations. And I'm doing research on a transnational litigation case against a French retail group that is named Casino. And that has a big subsidiary here in Brazil. It's actually the biggest subsidiary of the group. So basically supermarkets, right? A brand of supermarkets. And so the company has been sued in France for the deeds of its Brazilian subsidiary because it's buying beef. So it's buying beef from regions of the Amazon that are really affected by illegal deforestation. So there has been a case going on, and I'm just beginning a postdoc project on that. So it's entirely different from Total. It's also related with the regulation of transnational corporations and climate change, but the content or the protagonists are really entirely different from the fossil fuel industry.
Okay, but that sounds like kind of hot stuff, which are you doing there?
Yeah, yes.
Scientific research on the questions related to the climate. But how did you come to the last research? How did you come to focus on Total Energy and Alpha Aquitaine at that time?
Yeah. So this is the paper we published with my 2 colleagues, Christophe Bonneuil and Benjamin Fronta. We began to work on it 1.5 years ago. But for me, at this time, I had already defended my PhD, which was already on Total. But actually, when I started to work on the company itself, it was more as a sociologist. So I was interested in sociology of work, and I had already conducted interviews with around 40, 50 company, executives and employees, engineers mostly, during my PhD. And but at that time, I had not really taken the time to get into the archives and try to understand better Total's position on climate change. Of course, I was really interested in the topic, but I believe that I had the conventional wisdom, approach that Total was far less worse than Exxon, which is probably the case somehow. But I couldn't imagine that it had been really overtly climato-skeptic, right? And I didn't really search for, historical evidence that Total had been dissimulating things on climate change related issues. But then I met my French colleague, Christophe, who had been contacted. So 1 year and a half ago, I met my French colleague, who had been actually contacted by the American colleague, Ben Fronta, who had found, like by coincidence, a piece from the Internal Journal of Total from 1971, if I'm right, mentioning the issue of climate change as potentially serious, with anticipations of ppm for the year 2000 that turned out to be quite accurate. So these two, so the Christophe and Ben, started to talk and to discuss, and then Christophe identified me as having worked on Total, no? Because in France maybe the academic world is not so big as in the US, and we discussed, and it turned out that there was this opportunity, to really explore more deeply this historical approach that I had not really, explored during my PhD, but my contribution was the specificity of my research had enabled me to develop a quite good understanding of the internal logics of the corporation itself, right? So it was, I think the collaboration was really fruitful between different disciplines in the social sciences, right? History, because Ben Fronta was already a specialist of the historiography of climate change and private oil companies in the US, but didn't know about the French context. Christophe Bonneau is an environmental historian who perfectly knows is always working hard, to develop new scientific knowledge of environmental reflexivities during the post-World War II period, and with a very big, very consistent track record in environmental history. And I was more the sociologist in the room, with already a first knowledge of Total, of the history of the company also.
Okay, but the starting point of it was this information by Total from 1971.
Yes, 71.
I found it in the internet, and I want to show it to you briefly. It's maybe you can see it. It's a scan, which is very nicely done. But you can see this is the brochure. Total Information, which was an internal magazine, as I learned, right? Printed 6,000 copies for partners of the Total and for people working there. I just scanned through it. You can see there's an editorial where they talk about environment. It's mainly about air pollution. So this is the article. La pollution atmosphérique et le climat. So I think the first pages are only about air pollution, and the last 2 pages is about the climate. I think these two are the interesting parts and the interesting sentences. Can you tell something about what is mentioned there? What did Total report?
Yeah, I think what was a challenge for us, the authors, was to really contextualize, the perception of climate change throughout time. And that's really a challenge, right? Because one of the temptation will be probably to to transpose our fears of today on the 70s, right? The context was entirely different at the time. And that's often a critique that we receive from people in the industry, saying that we are just, applying the frameworks that we have today in the past, but it's not the case. Actually, we are just doing the reverse. So it's all the challenges, historicizing these knowledges that were produced. So I think also a thing that is quite important in this magazine from 1971 is that the preface is written and signed by the CEO. So for us, it was an interesting point to know, right? Is that the CEO has supposedly read and knows the content of the pages, right? So that's the first point.
Okay.
And then
editorial.
Yeah, René Granier de Liliac. No, I don't. If I remember well, I can't read.
Yeah,
but that's it.
René de Liliac.
René de Liliac. And also the scientist who was commissioned to write the article on the climate was not part of Total staff, right? He was an expert invited to write this article. And but it's not really, so he was not an internal staff, right? So he was an external expert. He was, and of course, at the time, what is important to remind is that, to bear in mind, is that since Total experts were mostly active in the geosciences, they were really connected with the climate sciences, right? Earth system sciences, basically. So you have this porous, this porous separation between worlds, between the different worlds of Earth system science, between more soil sciences, which were more the field of oil companies, and climate sciences that were a bit different, but still there were connections. And Durand Astes, so this climatologist, had a good knowledge of the American science that was already developed at the time. And it's interesting just because he's sharing to a French-speaking audience what was well known at the time, right, about the possibility of the probable hypothesis of a warming climate and the consequences it could have on the rainfall patterns. He was a specialist of India, actually, so he's writing about monsoons, about periods of droughts, etc., etc. And he's quite the projections is talking about. They turned out to be quite true, actually. So that's interesting, right? In retrospect.
Yep, that's 50 years ago, and I was surprised to learn that he made a good Vorhersage. What's that? Prediction how much the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would be in 2010, I think he said about.
But we couldn't trace what was the reception of this article, right? I mean, we lack written sources to evaluate if people really read it or they discussed about it, in Total's circles. It's difficult to know, right? So there are, of course, like historical research is always fragmentary. It cannot be, definitive in any sense.
Right, but you in your report, you said that there was quite a bit of awareness at that time in the beginning 70s.
Yeah, for sure. Because the audience of the of course, because the awareness on climate started to be built right in the US predominantly, right? But at the beginning of the 70s, the spreading of information about the global environment starts to accelerate. And if I'm not wrong, because sometimes I miss a year or two, 1961 is a presidential election in France, and it's the first time that we get a green candidate, right? So there are a lot of elements that are maybe crystallizing at the time. And just a few years later, we will have the Meadows report from Donella Meadows and her husband.
Yes.
That would be the limits to growth, right? Of course, we should not. So,
that's right.
And there were various alarm signals that had been raised by the time.
Dennis Meadows, Donella Meadows, Grenzen des Wachstums. Times. That would be the German title. And it was published, I think, during the first oil price crisis. So it had a lot of awareness.
First oil shock, that's it.
Yeah, that was the beginning of the.
And of course, in the late 50s, 60s, and at the beginning of the 70s, the MIT is producing reports. I don't remember the names. The SMIC reports, SMIC, we mentioned in the article, that were also quite clear about the risk of a climate catastrophe. One of the counter arguments we hear often is that the scientific community was not so clear in the 70s about whether we were going through a phase of warming or cooling. But in the study, at some point, we cite a meta-analysis that was done. I think it was done in the 2000s, so 21st century, about this period, looking back at what climate scientists were told, what were the different hypotheses in the air at the time. And it turns out that the hypothesis that people were believing about a cooling is not robust at the time. I mean, for some people, yeah, there were some hypotheses that were made in this direction, but they were never predominant. So climate change in the sense of a warming was always the most important hypothesis.
Right, that was the most important thing. But when you see at the temperature, the actual development of the temperature, I think during the 70s, there was not much warming. And even the 80s, it really started accelerating in the end of the 80s. And that's when it becomes interesting, I think. So can you tell me what happened in between this article from 1971 and the growing awareness in the age of the 80s? So around 88, I think there was a crucial year for the Americans, USA, because they had a drought there, and there was a lot of awareness, and the term climate crisis or global warming popped up in the newspapers. At that time, there was also George H.W. Bush, so the father of the later president. He was president, and he promised to do something about it, which failed in the end. But what was Total doing in this time? Do you have any?
About that? It occurs that between the publication of the first article in 1971 and 1986, we have very little, archival documents that were, available for study. So we don't quite know. There are holes, in the research, and we don't know what really happened at the time. So of course, we can reconstruct some elements, because in 1974, if I'm not wrong, IPIECA was created. So IPIECA was an initiative of the oil industry, mostly from American firms and European firms, to develop a platform on environmental issues to improve the capacity of the oil and gas industry to respond, to critiques by the environmental NGOs and governments. So there is from 1974 onwards, the industry is starting to build an expertise, in order to thwart a critique and to respond, but we don't have internal evidence of, discussions inside, Total executive circles. But we know that through IPIECA, so at the time, Exxon was already developing a climate research department, and they were, publishing articles on climate science. And there is evidence that people from IPIECA, through IPIECA, people from Exxon and Total met, at various meetings and conferences. So there was a circulation of knowledge on climate-related issues inside the oil and gas industry. And what appears in 1986, when we get new evidence of of climate change in Total's archival records, is that climate change appears to be put on the agenda of an executive committee of the group. It means that all the top managers gather for, weekly meetings that last probably for a morning. And they have an agenda with different points to address, with probably 20 to 30 minutes for every point. And in February of 1986, I think it's February, if I'm not wrong, we should check the article. So there, climate change is mentioned as part of the agenda. And in the briefing note, it can be read that Total is now confronted with the threat of, the government's doing something on climate change, and the director, or the person who is at the time the environmental director of the group, explains that the company must prepare to defend the measures that could be taken against the oil and gas industry, and that could turn out to be harmful for the business, right? So that's the main, and I think it's a key date. It's probably the most important date in our paper, because, the 1971 paper probably is a bit fortuitous in a way, right? So they commissioned these external scientists to write a note. I think it's really important and relevant, because it's the first time that the document mentioning climate change circulates inside the corporation, right? But the moment when the top managers of the corporations gather to talk openly about climate change as a business threat, or, of course, rather as a threat than an opportunity for them, is perhaps even more important, because now all the top managers are really reflexively aware of what's going on. And they have been told about this by Exxon.
Can you repeat the year again?
1986.
1986.
Yeah, I think what is important to bear in mind is that since the creation of Total and ELF, at the time the two they have not merged, right? They merged in 2000. So it's ELF executive committee. It's not Total, it's ELF executive committee, right? So because ELF's research capacities were stronger than Total at the time. So when you sum up all the historical emissions of these two firms, Total and ELF, and you take 1986 as a key point, then roughly it's not it's accurate, but maybe there is a margin here. But roughly, if you take all the historical emissions, the 2/3 of emissions were made after this pivotal moment of 1986 for the group, right?
For the group, so 2/3 of their emissions.
Of their emissions were after that date of 1986. So that's important too, because when you...
Okay. No, I didn't know that, but that's an interesting point, because I think half of the global CO2 emissions, which we have in the atmosphere right now, originate from the period after 1990, around roughly.
Yeah, so that's all more or less the order of magnitude. Yeah,
one was even more. So after this point, where the top managers of the ELF executive committee knew about the issue and prepared their responses, after that they emitted 2/3 of the total emissions in their life.
Yeah, that's the order of magnitude. I should check the figure, but that's really the I'm quite sure it's around that.
Yeah, that's a lot. So I would like to come to the conclusions. So we know, some of us know about the strategy that the American companies led by ExxonMobil, I think, chose. They chose to have the same advertisement campaign than they had with the tobacco industry had, denying the problem and attacking the scientists. But what did Total and ELF do in this perspective? So after this meeting in 1986, what did they embark on?
Yeah, so there was there are different phases in the history in this story now. So in the first phase, so just after the Rio conference in '92, what the archival record shows is that there were two lines emerged, inside ELF to discuss this issue of climate change. The first line was more moderate, asking for the company to step in, and to taking commitments. and to accept, the reality of climate science. And another line was more, inspired by, the external techniques, right, of, instilling doubts in the public sphere. We can trace that simply, in looking at how different directors inside the company tried to influence on the line, that the CEO was about to hold. So
that's interesting.
So there are memorandums that, by key top managers of health suggesting that the doubt strategy should be developed, right? But finally, this very aggressive approach was not the one that was selected on the long run, because in '97, just before Kyoto, the other line, which was more moderate, had won more or less, and the environmental director of the time was more or less the guy who wanted to show commitment, to commit, right? He suggested the CEO of Total was about to give an interview to the French newspaper Le Monde to tell some climate emissions reduction targets in Le Monde, which is it's exactly what it did. So it did probably, I don't remember again, maybe 15% reduction of GHG emissions by 2000 or something like this. I think it was that, or 2010. I don't remember. But after Kyoto, so this was the first moment when so 97 was the moment when the Total CEO, well, it was, I think it was for Total. I was thinking of the two, but maybe it was Total. Yeah, it was Total. Total CEO openly admitted that climate change, should described by scientists. So it was in '97. This first, media acknowledgement of the authority of climate scientists to develop, knowledge on climate change.
So to get this right, because
what is important is that sorry.
The internet connection was a bit bad at the moment, so I just want to repeat it to get it right. There were two approaches: a moderate approach led by a commitment to reduce some emissions, and a more aggressive approach, which some companies or some people in the management embarked on. Aggressive, I would think it was denial, openly denial. But then shortly before the climate conference in Kyoto, where the Kyoto Protocol was launched, there was a more moderate approach. There was an interview in the newspaper, promising a reduction by some 30% in a specific time, maybe, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, something. I don't know. I don't remember But I think what is interesting to bear in mind here is that, the difference between the more pragmatic and the more aggressive approach is that the second one, so the aggressive approach, wants to engage on the epistemology of climate change, right? How do we describe and engage, the epistemology of climate change? The pragmatic approach is more about, we should acknowledge the authority of science, but in the meantime, we can still block, regulations. That will be the more moderate approach. But what I think has to be borne in mind at this point is also the fact that in '97, just before Jaffré, so was a CEO of Total, talked to Le Monde, the CEO of BP, Lord Brown, had given a climate speech that was really impressive at the time, right? So there was also a mimicking effect, right? So Total was probably influenced by the bold tone of BP's CEO's discourse, and this is not to be excluded, right?
Okay.
Before Kyoto.
It was just before Kyoto, so that's very interesting. So the Total had a moderate approach at that time, so maybe they're better off and now because of that. but I think it continues. This line continues until this day, because they have a relaunch of their company right now. Now it's Total Energy.
Yes.
And a very complicated voyage from the old oil to better gas, and then some renewable eco stuff. So that's my impression. Not very clear.
Yeah. What is really interesting is that at the beginning of this new period, you're right, that begins in '97. At the beginning, the company is not so professional in the sense that you can still trace, in the public documentation that it releases, like for example, reports to investors. There are of course, they talk a bit about climate change, and there are glossaries, for example, where they define climate change. And until 2004, you can still trace in the way they frame, the sentence about climate change, like things that are really inaccurate. They will say, for example, in 2003, the hypothesis that has received the most attention is that human activities are at the origin of climate change, but some scientists are telling the contrary. So they will state that, for example, in 2003, while we know since the second report of the IPCC that there is absolutely, a very, very low probability that human activities couldn't be involved, in that climate change, right? So until 2004, they still make like formal errors in their communication, but starting from 2005, they start to be, clean. The communication becomes clean. They don't talk about climate science in a way that is wrong, but also they become quite professional, right, in using these climate references without telling lies. But so the discourse becomes more polished and more sophisticated, right? But on the whole, it doesn't really change the way they invest. That's really very simple, actually. So more investments in climate communication. It means that engaging people who know climate science, who know to talk about it, and maybe the strategy from 2005, the 97 and then 2005 to today, is just to develop a climate narrative that looks convincing because it's supposedly more realist than what climate scientists are advocating, because total folks are quite prone to say that they are the only one who knows the real constraints of delivering energy to the world. And climate scientists, they know about climate science, but they don't know about Brazilian and Chinese people who want to have their share in the pie of global economic growth. And they reclaim this kind of economic authority to develop frames of narratives that seem to be formally aligned with climate targets, but in reality are not. So, for example, what I say, it might look non-professional to say things like this. Like when I say there is discourse and then there is practice and there is a rift between the two. It's not only militant to say that, because, for example, I published another article which didn't release so much media attention in 2019, and I really tried to confront the climate strategies of Total with the references they were mentioning. Like, for example, they base their climate strategy plans on the plans that are delivered by the International Energy Agency. But then you look into the International Energy Agency and you try to look how they refer to IPCC reports. And I was doing this research in 2019. And then I realized that the EIA reports, they don't take into account the IPCC special report 1.5 degrees that was released in 2018 after the COP21. So then you realize that it's bottomless, right? So climate plans, because the production of climate science advances so fast, they don't have the time really to adapt and to develop climate strategy, climate plans that are really consistent, that take, you know, that take into consideration the evolution of the climate science, you know, consensus, right? Because it's getting a very, well, the climate diagnosis is moving very, very fast, right? And even the EIA is very criticized for this, because the scenarios they are producing, they are not constantly renovated with IPCC estimates, right? So it's not just, you know, saying, oh, Total is bad because they say things but they do the contrary. It's just that they are, from an epistemological point of view, they must build climate action plans taking into account a lot of other references that are moving very fast. And actually, since the worst case scenarios are basically happening since the last 10 years, they are always, well, short, you know, of arguments, because yeah, if you base your scenario on the EIA and then the EIA is disavowed by the IPCC, then it means that your scenario is disavowed, right?
Yeah. So you mean Total and the communication strategy of Total is lagging behind the
EIA,
of course, which is lagging behind the IPCC, the world.
Of course. And it's not, it's not all, a moral argument I'm making. It's just an epistemological argument, because the production of knowledge is so fast, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is,
So what I came across when looking through these brochures that Total Energy produced and distributed in the internet, I thought they are making a big hodgepodge of energy and making things really complicated, just to avoid the fact that the emissions, the CO2 emissions, and of course the methane emissions as well, have to go down. So I would like to eliminate this, because I've something what I want to show you to illustrate it, which would be the new Total Energy logo. So can you see it? Oh, it's the German page. They have this new logo, and they want to illuminate that it's a voyage from the bad oil, which is here bloody red.
Oh, I didn't know that, actually. Thanks.
And then they come to the blue, which is gas. They invested a lot into gas. They want to even enhance it. And the rest is a little bit eco stuff, ending with
solar
electricity. Electricity from renewables. And when you look at what they tell the investors, which is here, maybe we can see better.
Yeah, the arrows are supposed to do the job.
Yes, right. You see the journey between 2090 and 2030. So that's just 11 years. And you can see the oil which they want to produce and sell is not really going down, but gas, natural gas, is going up a lot, mostly because of LNG, which they want to import. LNG gas comes from all countries, the United States, for example, from fracking, Argentina from fracking, other gases as well, and which is going up. And then some growth in electricity from renewables. That's, I think, basically wind power and solar power, which should go up relatively high, but in the end, it's still a small bit of it. And the important stuff would be to bring the emissions down from this stuff, from the oil and gas. So that's what shocked me most, that Total is still thinking of gas as a transition fuel, Brückentechnologie or Brückenbrennstoff transition, and has heavily invested in that. And the latest investment, I think, is in Iraq. It's also in gas, to improve the outcome of the gas there. So, and on the same time, they're making a big fuss about this transition stuff through a lot of different forms of energy. I think I have to go back here. This is what they are intending to do. So they have the red oil that will sink a little bit. They have the gas, which is going up, and then warmth and stuff from gas, electricity, hydrogen as well, biomass is here, and in the end there is electricity from onshore and offshore wind energy, and this is photovoltaic, so solar energy. So that's what they are planning to do, but the most thing they want to do is still stick to oil and further invest into gas. Well, so I see they do something. They admit that there is a need to come to a more cleaner source of energy. But what they are doing on the ground is still rising emissions. It will mean until 2030, and leaving it to the rest of the world to bring emissions down. So having said this, I want to come back to another period before we end this talk, and that's about the role of Total and ELF in the EU legislation in the beginning 90s. What I learned from your study is that the EU Commission, there was an idea about, about having a kind of carbon tax, introducing a carbon tax. And what you've written there is that the oil industry, the European oil industry, especially ELF and Total, lobbied a lot against it, so that it kind of failed in 1992. Can you tell us a bit more about this part? Sorry, you are muted. We can't hear you. Pierre-Louis, you're muted. Can you hear us? Still muted. So obviously, there is no way to unmute.
Yeah, is it better now?
Now, yeah, you're fine now. Okay. So now you're muted again. Now it's good.
Oh my God, what's going on? That's busy.
Maybe the line is a bit.
Is that right?
Now it's right.
The audio was quite unstable. I don't know why, but now it should be okay. Is it okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. So.
Okay. No, there are two steps here. The first one is 1992. And so because in 92, so the COP the first COP in Rio was scheduled for the end of the year in November. And the European Commission wanted to arrive, at Rio with some proposals for regulations. And one of the options was to come with a green tax, an eco tax, right? And there was a proposal for such a tax that had been drafted already, and I think it's France Minister of Economy that's changed, and Dominique Strauss-Kahn came to be later the lead of the IMF, was nominated. He decided to, he was pressured by Total to change this text, right, this proposal, and to basically remove this option of an eco tax. And it's actually what happened. So the Europe arrived at Rio in 92 without an actionable, plan, to mitigate greenhouse gases emission. And 2 years later, in 94, there was another attempt, to introduce an eco tax at the European level. And again, we have some archival evidence that the two So Total and Elf both lobbied against the possibility of this of such a tax to be implemented. And there are notably some, records of contacts between Elf and Total, or one of the two companies, and the French ministries at the time, and also some testimonies from Total executives at the time who have explained to us how the company was already deploying lobbyists in Brussels in order to avoid, the tax scheme to be elaborated and implemented at the European level. So again, on this part of the story, we lack, of course, we have some sources. The evidence could be made in a way that will be even stronger with additional sources, but what we have is already sufficient to show that the two companies were part of the business coalitions that undermined, the projects to implement a carbon tax quite early on, in the history of global anthropogenic emissions, right? If we keep the date of 90 as the pivotal year when we cross the line of the half, of total historic emissions being emitted.
Okay. So that was, to repeat this, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was later the director of the International Monetary Fund, also Weltbank, the IMF, IWF.
IMF, yeah.
IMF, yeah, the Monetary Fund. He was kind of influenced by these two companies, Elf and Total, so that withdrew somehow this proposal for a carbon tax.
Yeah. But I mean, it was not an isolated case, right? There is another, on a very different front line, if I can say so. So in the 2000s in France, we had a series of litigation cases against many French politicians that were involved in a scandal of illegal financing of political parties by Elf. And at the time, so the exposure of public figures to corruption by oil and gas companies was really widespread. So we named Dominique Strauss-Kahn here because he was playing an important role, in this coalition of people that were involved, in the preparation of the COP the first COP in Rio '92. But in fact, many people were also corrupted by oil funds, at the time. So it's not just a matter of criticizing Strauss-Kahn, right? It's just to pinpoint his precise role on this precise point of climate regulation issues.
Okay, so this was a common issue. The French oil and gas industry
quite common, sadly, yeah.
Engaged in kind of lobbying, corrupting politicians and parties. So that's something which we have in Germany as well, but not from the oil industry, because we don't have a big oil company here in this country. So, well, I would like to come to an end now, and I just wonder whether there are some questions. I have not seen any. Maybe, Marco, you can paste them here. No questions. I just get the message. So what I would like to show you and recommend to you is this very interesting report, scientific report from you, Pierre-Louis Choquet. I will share it. Can you see it? You can download it or see it on the internet. Early warnings and emerging accountability, Total's responses to global warming, 1971 to 2021. I don't know, Marco, whether you can put the link to this study in the comments of YouTube. I've read it. It's really nicely written, I must say, easy to understand. Lots of links there too. And well, everything you want. It's no pictures, just a story, an interesting story that I really recommended for reading. And I did a bit further research and learned that the role of the Europe globally is very strong concerning the climate and the environment in general. So it's really painful to learn that at this crucial time in the beginning 90s, before the Earth Summit in Rio, that two oil and gas companies, or maybe more in Europe, influenced the process so that the Europe went to Rio empty-handed, without a good proposal for a carbon tax. So later on, I learned this carbon tax was transferred into a voluntary agreement that emissions should come down somehow. The Germans were involved, the German industry as well, with our Chancellor Helmut Kohl at that time. And even later on, there was this proposal of a European trading scheme, so where you can trade with emissions, which made the whole thing very complicated and ineffective in the beginning, because the prices for putting out carbon was much too low. It just developed some ability to steer away from fossils in the last years. So when the price of the carbon emissions went up. Okay, so I end this. Now the question, do you have any questions? And you can, last chance to put them here. I can see no questions. So then I would say, Pierre-Louis, would you like to have a final?
Yeah, maybe a small point of conclusion. I think the controversy, of the compatibility of Total like business strategy and climate change is a huge issue, right? I mean, for any scrupulous person who wants to know whether Total's climate strategy and business plan is aligned with the IPCC requirements, it's quite difficult if you really engage and try to prove, because then you have to compare, different scenarios and the assumptions on which these scenarios are based, and it becomes quite difficult. And I think this is also part of the, I can't know because I've not really researched that part, so it's really off the research. But I think that it's also one of the strategic advantage of Total in this situation is to generate climate strategies that are difficult to engage and discuss. Because if you want to engage and discuss with them, you will have to dive into, all the epistemology of climate projections. So you have to read the IPCC, compare with IEA, then compare with many sources of data, and it takes a lot of time. So while we discuss the relevancy of climate, strategic plans, we're not really, it's on their side. I mean, they are gaining time. So I think what we should do is scrutinize more closely their portfolios, right? Because of course, before COP26 in Glasgow, I think it's the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, like repeated, and there are more and more international organizations, and I think the IEA was quite vocal about this recently, that no new projects should be put on track, right? So what is important, I think, to look at is not really Total climate strategy plan. I think it's important to try to have a look at it and understand how it's constructed, but look at the big investment projects, right? Mozambique, Russia, and try to Angola, US, and try to assess whether they're really serious with, the 1.5 target. And I mean, very often it's very difficult to understand how you could put like tens of billions of dollars today for projects that will generate GHG emissions for the next 3 decades, when the emergency now is to change the whole infrastructures you know, of developed countries, and to avoid like emerging countries to get you know, gas infrastructures. So yeah, I think we shouldn't get fascinated by these climate plans because yeah, it can take a lot of time to discuss them. And,
yeah. That's a a strategy just to make things complicated.
If I can finish maybe with a more general remark, is that oil and gas companies in all Western countries, they always have been like important institutions in developing narratives about the future, right? It has always been the case in the US, in the UK, and also in France. And I think that it's entirely normal that they are talking about climate change. It's because they want to be able to show, that they are able to secure the future. But I mean, well, the problem is that, I mean, they are not doing climate science. They don't really know climate science. They don't have the time to engage with climate science. And so it's a source of fragility for them because, I mean, climate scientists can discuss and criticize their business plans now, because so I think we shouldn't give too much credit to these narratives about the future that they're trying to develop.
Yeah, which they're doing a lot, and you have to be prepared when you engage in conversation with companies like that. I think the campaign Collapse Total, to avoid total collapse, has the goal to not engage in talking, because I think we don't trust the ability of these big oil companies to really change, to really become a renewable energy company. I think it's the job of others to develop, to become renewable energy companies. And I think when you look at the value, the market value of those companies, it's going down. It's not in recent times because the oil price went up again. But in general, ExxonMobil, I think they shrank a lot. I think they were in 2013 still the biggest, most valuable company in the world. And I learned last year that they shrank a lot and are now less valuable than the Zoom, which we are talking about over the meeting software. It was more valuable than ExxonMobil. So it's incredible. This changed. I think this changed because the oil price went up. But I think in the long run, these big oil and gas companies, and of course the coal companies, will lose their value and maybe even go bankrupt. And that's the one thing which I want to tell the investors, because I've said in the beginning, I engaged with Fossil Free Berlin, and we have a campaign running for 3 years now that the German government does no longer invest its pension savings into companies like Total and Eni, for example, the Italian oil company. And they changed it actually. So they created a new portfolio, and you do not guess which is the biggest oil company in the new portfolio, which is supposed to be more sustainable. It's Total again. And they even added ExxonMobil on this. So it's incredible, and we are still going on. We are going on with this campaign because we believe that the big oil and gas companies don't have a future. That's the one thing. And the second thing, I will show you the picture again. This is what Total actually plans to do until 2030. Just get a bit the oil down a little bit, and the gas up. And the gas, I think it's a very dangerous strategy as well, because the so-called natural gas actually is methane, and methane is on a short time scale 80 to 100 times more dangerous to the climate than carbon dioxide is. All right. So thank you.
Thanks a lot for your invitation.
I thank you for talking to us. I would recommend your study to all the ones who are still looking.
Thank you very much, Christophe, for your introduction and for your cautious reading of our work. It's always a joy, right, to see that scientific articles are being read and can nurture, the commitment of citizens, right? Because science is meant to help, people understand better the world where they live, right?
Right. But your article or your scientific report is an easy read, I would say. Yeah, complicated scientific blah blah. It's really an easy read, so I recommend. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day in Brazil, and we.
And good evening in Germany.